So we're going to continue our discussion about the origin of the current conflict in the so-called Middle East uh, between the Palestinians and the state of Israel. This will be the fourth part of that, and the reason that we're doing this is to shed light on the source of the conflict and to demonstrate that the reason that the Palestinian people are fighting is because they basically had the land that they had inhabited be colonized and taken from them, and then they being marginalized uh, in a land by people who have no rightful claim to that area. And as I pointed out on the last show, because as you know, our show is called Journey into Self, which is primarily a spiritual pursuit, and typically I do shows that focused on spirituality and helping to bring some spiritual insight. But as I've also pointed out, that spirituality is not an escape from life. We are here for a purpose, and part of the purpose of our life is to bring to play our part in bringing forth light to humanity. Each of us is to play our part. I take a particular focus in bringing light. I see that as a responsibility of mine, for I have been given the name Sarah. That was not a name that I bestowed upon myself, but it was bestowed upon me. And being that Sarah's son of Ra, son of God, Ra being the light, then it is indeed part of my responsibility to play my part in bringing light. And as we experience life, it is also the responsibility of the spiritually awakened to battle against the forces of darkness, and to and some of the ways that you battle with darkness is to shed light on it. So we're not here to disparage anyone, but it's important that we promote righteousness and fight against unrighteousness. It is our responsibility to do so. And I take that responsibility upon myself to do my part. Okay, so with that said, again, we've been spending some time going into the history of the people who today call themselves to be Jews, and we went through some information to basically identify that even that name is a misnomer. Last show we had Benjamin Friedman, who grew up identifying with being a Jew, which he ended up later renouncing. He was an insider, and he was very familiar with the noted Zionist Jews that were influencing the government, the United States government. He identified how the United States got into the war, which was World War II, which initially the United States was not in. And he identified that the primary influence in the decision to bring the United States into the war was the Zionist Jews seeking the assistance of the United States in establishing the state of Israel and Palestine. Okay, and so as we go through the information, we will begin to uncover that not only has have the Ashkenazic Jews, which we have traced to the Khazar kingdom, wherein in approximately 713 AD, that the King Bulan of the Khazar, chose to convert to the religion of Judaism as a political decision. And then since then, their descendants have been primarily identified with with Jewry, as it were. And the predominant amount of people who identify as being Jews are the descendants of the Khazars, or the Ashkenazic Jews. As we delve further into it, however, we'll find that there's even more to be unpacked with that, and that relates to so-called Black people, and we'll find that a number of so-called Black people were the actual, and are the actual descendants of the Canaanites, who came to be known as Hebrews, or the Hebrews who went into Canaan and basically established themselves as Israelites. Anyhow, so we want to start with, and we'll get to that latter piece eventually, but we're going to continue our focus on the Khazars. And but before we get started with that, I want to play a clip from Stokely Carmichael, because this is an issue that has been in our community and has been has always been here. It's always been something, a subject of debate. There's always been some level of solidarity between the Black people and the Palestinians, because we've both been able to see how our lands have been colonized and taken from us by the same forces. And so, we could always relate to that situation. Um, and, and as Steve Coakley has put forth to us in his great work that he's done, there's been a lot of influence by the Jewish Zionists in the affairs of uh, so-called African American or Black people in this country. So there's a lot to unpack there. So we're going to start by playing a clip from Kwame Ture, who speaks about the Zionist struggle.
Constant struggle. We want to make this aspect of constant struggle clear. Of course, the capitalist system, of course, will confuse you. It presents things only as one-sided, that things are only one side. When they talk about the Indians and the cowboys, you just get the cowboy side, not the Indian side. When they talk about the struggle in Palestine, it's just the Zionists, never the Palestine. I mean, never. The other day, someone was sitting down looking at a movie. It was a movie about how these, the Jewish people had suffered, and now because they're suffering, they were going to Palestine, a Zionist picture. So it was on television. So I walked out the room. Someone said, "Oh, you are so racist." I said, "I'm racist." "Yes, this is a story. It's just a story about people suffering, and just that suffering, and you think." I said, "When last have you seen a picture of a Palestinian family suffering on television? You will never see it. You will never see it because they don't want to work up your sentiments to support the Palestinians. So the only stories you see are suffering stories of them all the time, all the time, all the time. One-sided view of life is given everywhere, this one-sided view of life. We must come to look at the other side. We must come to investigate the other side. And when you investigate the other side falls. I told you that I was a socialist, and I am. I know that, I must tell you this because capitalism just confuses you. The other day I told a brother I was socialist. He said, "You still socialist?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "But it fell." I said, "Really?" He said, "Yeah, you didn't hear about it?" I said, "No, I didn't hear about it." He said, "It collapsed." I said, "Oh." He said, "You hear about the Soviet Union? They're gone." I said, "Really?" I said, "Listen." I said, "You mustn't get confused. Capitalism doesn't just rape your labor and rip off your resources. It deforms your thinking. It deforms your thinking." I told the man, "You're not thinking." He said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I saw it happen. It's finished." I said, "You never judge a system by its adherents. You never judge any system by its believers. You judge it by its principles." He said, "I don't understand what you're talking about." I said, "All I'm saying to you, brother, is..."
So that was from our late brother, Kwame Ture, then known as Stokely Carmichael. And this was done in the early 70s. Just to put things into context. Brother Kwame Ture's words ring quite true to this day, if not more so. Everything that he stated in that clip is still true today. In reference to the media coverage has been one-sided. As he said, it's primarily on the side of the Zionists. Very seldom do you hear the perspective of the Palestinians. Very seldom do you hear any stories about the Palestinians suffering. It's there because it's occurring, but that's not the focus of the media. And of course, part of the reason for that is because of who controls the media, which is heavily controlled by Zionist Jews. Okay, so there's another thing before we get into the information that I want to share with you. And this video was shared with me by one of our brothers, Brother Cloyd. And I found this one quite interesting. And this is an Israeli leader speaking at a meeting, and it appears that they're speaking with some representatives of the United States government, and the individual speaking is from the Israeli consulate. So let's play that clip.
Video of the Israeli government holding a private convention here in the United States. One of the people in attendance at this secret meeting was Judith Varnai Shorer. She's a former Israeli consul general who was operating out of Atlanta. She was one of the main people saying that the biggest problem that they had was young black people in the United States. But don't worry, they've got some black leaders on the payroll.
The major problem with Israel is when the young generation of the black community. The problem with Israel is when the young generation of the black community. That is when the young generation of the black community.
This was an Israeli government official who was saying this, not some low-level operative or some rogue member of their diplomatic corps. This was a senior member of their administrative government who was saying this on American soil. Their biggest problem wasn't Hamas or Hezbollah or the Palestinian Authority or Syria or even Iran. She said that Israel's biggest problem was young black people in the United States.
I found that to be of particular interest and pretty heavy, that the Israelis would identify young black people as their primary problem. So it is upon us to unpack why they share that perspective. And what was immediately brought to mind was the attacks on Kyrie Irving when he put out, or excuse me, not even put out, but when he posted a link to the movie Hebrews to Negroes. And by the way, if you have not watched that movie, I highly recommend it. And I would not only recommend viewing it, but I recommend having that in one's library, because it is very, very well documented. And is good for study. And so, given that you have black people who are becoming more aware, engaging in the type of research that the brother who put together the movie is doing, you can see why it is that they would identify the young black generation as their primary threat, because part of the reason that all of this is unfolding the way it is based upon how history has been distorted to basically change who people are, to ascribe to a group of people something, a heritage that not only does not belong to them, but belongs to someone else. And the threat is of that information coming to light. And um, and when anyone begins the process of starting to bring this type of information to light, uh, they become the subject of attacks. They are labeled as being anti-Semitic. And if they want to continue, particularly if they're in the entertainment industry or athletes, are forced to either disavow their comments or they're forced to discontinue their career. And so then we ask, why? Why is it such an issue? Why does it evoke that type of response? And certainly, why is there no debate on the veracity of the information rather than just placing a label and making accusations of anti-Semitism? Because you could end the argument with a discussion of the facts. And that's part of the problem for them, is that they don't seek to have a discussion of the facts because the facts don't bear them out. So with that, we're going to segue into our book, Facts Are Facts, by Dr. David Goldstein, who basically compiled the information from Benjamin Friedman, who we heard from on our last show. So I'll continue from the book. We'll start on page 52 of the book, Facts Are Facts, and he says, "My many years of intensive research established beyond the question of any doubt, contrary to the generally accepted belief held by Christians, that the so-called or self-styled Jews in Eastern Europe at any time in their history in Eastern Europe were never the legendary lost tribes of Bible lore. That historical fact is incontrovertible." And before I continue to read, I'll again point out that Mr. Friedman himself was a so-called or self-styled Jew himself. He's making this comment. So would he be then considered to be anti-Semitic or self-hating Jew? But no. He has come to this conclusion based upon, as he said, many years of intensive research. He goes on to say, relentless research establishes equally true that the so-called or self-styled Jews in Eastern Europe at no time in their history could be correctly regarded as the direct lineal descendants of the legendary lost 10 tribes of Bible lore. The so-called or self-styled Jews in Eastern Europe in modern history cannot legitimately point to a single ancient ancestor who ever even set foot on the soil of Palestine in the era of Bible history. Research also revealed that the so-called or self-styled Jews in Eastern Europe were never Semites, are not Semites now, nor can they ever be regarded as Semites at any future time by any stretch of the imagination. Exhaustive research also irrevocably rejects as a fantastic fabrication that generally accepted belief by Christians in the so-called or self-styled Jews in Eastern Europe are the legendary chosen people so very, very vocally publicized by the Christian clergy from their pulpits. He goes on to say, and he makes this allusion to the talk that we heard last week. He says in the year 1948 in the Pentagon, he addressed a large assembly of the highest officers of the United States Army in the G2 branch of military intelligence on the highly explosive geopolitical situation in Eastern Europe and in the Middle East. And he considered that to be a potential threat to the peace of the world and the security of this nation. And he went on to explain this history that he's sharing here in the book. And his reason was that he felt that it's not possible to understand or to evaluate properly what's been taking place there since 1917, the year after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. He says a key to the problem. He says the Russian conquest in the 10th to 13th century of the little to known Khazars apparently ended the existence for all time of the little known to history 800,000 square mile sovereign kingdom of the so-called self-styled Jews in Eastern Europe, then known as the Khazar Kingdom. So he's referencing that in the 10th to 13th century, Russia conquered Khazar, causing a dispersion of the so-called Jews who had converted to Judaism. And so with that conquest that ended that kingdom, and he says, historians and theologians now agree that this political development was the reason for the important change in the wording of the Kol Nidre. And when he says the Kol Nidre, that is a tenet that's outlined in the Babylonian Talmud. And he says the important change of the wording of the Kol Nidre by Meir ben Samuel in the 11th century, and for the policy adopted by the so-called self-styled Jews that the law of revocation in advance was not made public. And I'll just briefly say the Kol Nidre is basically a vow that is to be taken at the beginning of the year by so-called Jews, that any vows that when they enter into at any point during the year, that they can basically disavow any vows. Okay, so we'll go on. He says on page 54, in the 1st century BC, the Khazars invaded Eastern Europe from their homeland in Asia. The Khazars were not Semites. They were an Asiatic Mongoloid nation. They are classified by modern anthropologists as Turco-Finns racially. From the time immemorial, the homeland of the Khazars was in the heart of Asia. The very warlike Khazars did not find it difficult to subdue and conquer the 25 peaceful agricultural nations occupying the approximately 1 million square miles in Eastern Europe. In a comparative short period, the Khazars established the largest and most powerful kingdom in Europe, and probably the wealthiest also. He says their religious worship was a mixture of phallic worship and other idolatrous worship practiced in Asia by pagan nations. The vile forms of sexual excesses indulged in by the Khazars as their form of religious worship produced a degree of moral degeneracy the Khazar king could not endure. In the 7th century, King Bulan, ruler at the time of the Khazar kingdom, decided to abolish the practice of phallic worship and other idolatrous worship and make one of the three monotheistic religions, about which he knew very little, the new state religion. After his historic session with representatives of the three monotheistic religions, King Bulan decided against Christianity and Islam and selected as the future state religion of the religious worship then known as Talmudism and now known and practiced as Judaism. It says this event is well documented in history. So King Bulan and his 4,000 feudal nobles were promptly converted by rabbis imported from Babylonia for that event. The Khazar kings invited large numbers of rabbis to come and open synagogues and schools to instruct the population in new forms of religious worship. It has now become the state religion. The converted Khazars were the first population of so-called or self-styled Jews in Eastern Europe. So-called or self-styled Jews in Eastern Europe after the conversion of the Khazars are the descendants of the Khazars converted to Talmudism, or as is now known, Judaism, by the 7th century mass conversion of the Khazar kingdom. Okay. Well, let me read this and then I'll have a comment. The Khazar kingdom became a virtual theocracy. The religious leaders imposed the teachings of the Talmud upon the population as their guide to living. The theologies of the Talmud became the axis of political, cultural, economic, and social attitudes and activities throughout the Khazar kingdom. The Talmud provided civil and religious law. Okay, and so you hear that he makes the point to say that what they were practicing was Talmudism, which has now come to be known to us as Judaism. Okay, there was nothing called Judaism during those times of the conversion. And the Talmudism, which he makes it a point to say, and as is documented in the book, it escapes my mind, but it's documented that the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud were basically the codes for living that were compiled and created by the priesthood. And they wrote these, and as they wrote the Talmuds, the two Talmuds, they would also begin to revise the Torah. Okay, and you'll recall that in one of the previous shows, I read what used to exist in earlier versions of the King James Version of the Bible, where it said, Holy Bible, commissioned in 1611, commonly referred to as the King James Version, translated out of the original tongues, diligently compared and revised. Okay, and so when we go into the book, and I don't have it with me, but you'll see where they documented that both that the Torah, or the first 5 books uh, of the Bible, went through a number of changes to correlate to what had been written in the Talmud. And so as you read the Bible, you'll start to see a change in tone occur once you complete the reading of Genesis. And then once you start to get into Deuteronomy and Numbers and things like that, you see a whole different depiction of God, quote unquote. God no longer is a loving and merciful God. God transforms into someone who is vengeful, angry, jealous. When God previously claimed to be no respecter of persons, God has a chosen people, which they basically chose themselves to be that. He directs them to murder and kill people, take their land, right? So these things ended up being revised and written in to the Torah, to be consistent with what had been and what was being written into the respective Talmuds, being the Jerusalem and Babylonian Talmud. Okay, so he goes on to say, he makes reference to volume 4, pages 1 to 5 of the Jewish Encyclopedia, where the Jewish Encyclopedia refers to the Khazars as Chazars, spelled respectively Khazars and Chazars. So the two spellings are optional according to the best authorities, but the two are pronounced alike. So either Khazars with a K or Khazars with a C. Okay, and so here's the quote from the Jewish Encyclopedia on the Khazars. It says Khazars. This is from the encyclopedia, mind you. Khazars, a people of Turkish origin whose life and history are interwoven with the very beginnings of the history of Jews of Russia. Driven on by the nomadic tribes of the steppes and by their own desire for plunder and revenge, in the second half of the 6th century, the Khazars moved westward. The kingdom of the Khazars was firmly established in most of South Russia before the foundation of the Russian monarchy by the Varangians in 885 AD. At this time, the kingdom of the Khazars stood at the height of its power and was constantly at war. At the end of the 8th century, the Kagan, king of the Khazars, and his grandees, together with a large number of his people, embraced the Jewish religion. The Jewish population in the entire domain of the Khazars in the period between the 7th and 10th centuries must have been considerable. About the 9th century, it appears as if all the Khazars were Jews and that they had been converted to Judaism only a short time before. It was one of the successors of Bulan named Obadiah who regenerated the kingdom and strengthened the Jewish religion. He invited Jewish scholars to settle in the dominions and founded synagogues and schools. The people were instructed in the Bible, Mishnah, and the Talmud in the divine service of the Hazan. In their writings, the Khazars used the Hebrew letters, the Khazar language just predominated. Obadiah was succeeded by son Isaac, Isaac by his son Moses or Manasseh II, later by his son Nisi, and Nisi by his son Aaron II. King Joseph himself was the son of Aaron and ascended the throne in accordance with the law of the Khazars relating to succession. This seems to have been the beginning of the downfall of the Khazar kingdom. Varangians established themselves at Kiev until the final conquest of the Khazars by the Russians. After a hard fight, the Russians conquered the Khazars. 4 years later, the Russians conquered all the Khazarian territory east of the Azov. Many members of the Khazarian royal family immigrated to Spain. Some people went to Hungary, but the great mass of the people remained in their native country, which would have been Russia. The greatest historian of the origin and the history of the so-called or self-styled Jews in Eastern Europe was Professor H. Graetz, himself a so-called or self-styled Jew. Professor H. Graetz points out in his famous History of the Jews that when so-called or self-styled Jews in other countries heard a rumor about so-called or self-styled Jews in the Khazar kingdom, they believed these converted Khazars would be the 10 lost tribes. These rumors were no doubt responsible for the legend that grew up that Palestine was the homeland of the converted Khazars. On page 141 of his History of the Jews, Professor Graetz states, the Khazars professed a coarse religion which was combined with sensuality and lewdness. After Obadiah came a long series of Jewish kings, for according to the fundamental law of the state, only Jewish rulers were permitted to ascend the throne. For some time, the Jews of other countries had no knowledge of the conversion of this powerful kingdom of to Judaism. And when at last a vague rumor to this effect reached them, they were of the opinion that the Khazaria was peopled by the remnants of the former tribes. When the Khazars in the 1st century BC invaded Eastern Europe, their mother tongue was an Asiatic language referred to in the Jewish encyclopedia as the Khazar languages. They were primitive Asiatic dialects without any alphabet or written form. When King Bulan was converted in the 7th century, he decreed that the Hebrew characters he saw in the Talmud and other Hebrew documents was thereupon to become the alphabet for the Khazar language. The Hebrew characters were adopted to the phonetics of the spoken Khazar language. The Khazars adopted the characters of the so-called Hebrew language in order to provide a means for providing a written record of their speech. Since the conquest of the Khazars by the Russians and the disappearance of the Khazar kingdom, the language of the Khazars is known as Yiddish. Okay. There, I will interject that that is the reason why Ashkenazic Jews have to go to Hebrew school to learn Hebrew, because Hebrew is not their native tongue. Yiddish is their tongue, which is a derivative of the Khazar language. Okay, so it says, since the conquest of the Khazar by the Russians and the disappearance of the Khazar kingdom, the language of the Khazar is known as Yiddish. For about 6 centuries, the so-called or self-styled Jews of Eastern Europe have referred to themselves, while still resident in their native Eastern European countries, as Yiddish by nationality. They identify themselves as Yiddish rather than Russian, Polish, Galician, Lithuanian, or Romanian, or Hungarian, or by the nation to which they were citizens. They also referred to the common language that they all spoke as Yiddish. Before it became known that as the Yiddish language, the mother tongue of the Khazars added many words to its limited ancient vocabulary as necessity required. These words were acquired from the language of its neighboring nations with whom they have political or social or economic relations. Languages of all nations add to their vocabularies in the same way. The Khazars adopted words to their requirements from the German, Slavonic, and Baltic languages. The Khazars adopted a great number of words from the German language. The Germans had a much more advanced civilization than their Khazar neighbors, and the Khazars sent children to German schools and universities. Yet he says the Yiddish language is not a German dialect. Many people are led to believe so, including me, are led to believe so because Yiddish has borrowed so many words from the German language. And the reason I said that was that I had a debate at one time with someone from work who considered himself to be a Jew, so-called, and he was on this diatribe about his heritage, and I ended up taking exception to some of the things that he said and pointed out to him that, his people are not cannot be traced to Israel, Palestine, and are not Hebrews. I pointed out that his people have to go to Hebrew school to learn Hebrew, and that their native tongue is Yiddish, which I said was a German dialect. And so he points out here that it's not a German dialect, though it borrows significantly from the German language. And as I pointed it out to the coworker, he acknowledged that when his brother went to Germany, that he was able to understand a lot of what was spoken in Germany. Okay, so he says the Yiddish language is not a German dialect. Many people are led to believe so because Yiddish has borrowed so many words from the German language. If Yiddish is a German dialect acquired from the Germans, then what language did the Khazars speak for 1,000 years they existed in Eastern Europe before they acquired culture from the Germans? The Khazars must have spoken some language when they invaded Eastern Europe. What was that language? When did they discard it? How did the entire Khazar population discard one language and adopt another all of a sudden? The idea is too absurd to discuss. Yiddish is the modern name for the ancient mother tongue of the Khazars, with added German, Slavonic, and Baltic adopted and adapted numerous words. Yiddish must not be confused with Hebrew because they both use the same characters as their alphabets. There is not one word of Yiddish in ancient Hebrew, nor is there one word of ancient Hebrew in Yiddish. Okay, I'll leave that there. There's some other things that they say, but just further to just go on and make the point about the language. He goes on to say, approximately 90% of the world's so-called or self-styled Jews living in 42 different countries of the world today are either immigrants from Eastern Europe or their parents emigrated from Eastern Europe. Yiddish is a language common to all of them as their first or second language according to where they were born. It is an international language to them. Okay, I'm going to skip forward. There's so much here to cover. He says, in the many wars with their neighbors in Europe after the 13th century, Russia was required to cede to her victors large areas, and this is important here that I'm going to read. So in many wars with her neighbors in Europe after the 13th century was required to cede to her victors large areas which are originally part of the Khazar kingdom. In this manner, Poland, Lithuania, Galicia, Hungary, Romania, and Austria acquired from Russian territory originally a part of the Khazar kingdom. And I would add to that, what's that? Sorry, it's early. My mind is escaping me a little bit. But the other war that's going on right now is related to the situation here. And I will pull that up in just a second. We'll come back to that. Anyway, it's important now, really, in terms of understanding what's going on in both of the wars that are occurring right now, because the other war is occurring in the same area that was part of the Khazar kingdom. Together with this territory, these nations acquired a segment of the population of so-called or self-styled Jews descended from the Khazars who once occupied the territory. These frequent boundary changes by the nations in Eastern Europe explains the presence today of so-called or self-styled Jews in all these countries who trace their ancestry back to the converted Khazars. Their common language, their common culture, their common religion, and their common racial characteristics classify them all beyond any question of doubt with the Khazars who invaded Eastern Europe in the 1st century BC and were converted to Talmudism in the 7th century. Okay, and again, he said Talmudism as opposed to Judaism. Okay, he says Talmudism or Judaism as Talmudism is known today could have survived. Talmudism, the civil and religious code of the Pharisees. Okay, so that when I made reference earlier to the priesthood who wrote the respective Talmuds, being the Babylonian, the Jerusalem Talmud. He says Talmudism, the civil and religious code of the Pharisees, most likely would have passed out of existence like the many other creeds and cults practiced by the peoples in that area before and during and after Phariseeism, assumed this prominent position among these creeds and cults in the time of Jesus. And I'll have to go back to kind of put this in context. So it says the so-called or self-styled Jews throughout the world today of Eastern European origin make up at least 90% of the world's total population of so-called or self-styled Jews. The conversion of King Balan of the Khazar nation in the 7th century accomplished for Talmudism, or for Judaism, as Talmudism is called today, was the conversion of Constantine in the Western European nations accomplished for Christianity. Christianity, a small, comparatively unimportant religious belief practiced principally in the Eastern Mediterranean area until the conversion to the Christian faith of large populations of the Western pagan nations after the conversion of Constantine. And so then he says Talmudism or Judaism, as Talmudism is known today, could have survived. He says Talmudism as Phariseeism was called later, would have disappeared with all its contemporary creeds and cults but for the conversion of the Khazars to Talmudism in the 7th century. At the time, Talmudism was on its way to complete oblivion. In the year 986 AD, the ruler of Russia, Vladimir III, became a convert to the Christian faith in order to marry a Catholic Slavonic princess of a neighboring sovereign state. In 820 AD, Vladimir III and his successors of the rulers of Russia attempted in vain to convert his so-called or self-styled Jews, now Russian subjects, to Russia's Christian state religion and to adopt the customs and culture of the numerically predominant Russian Christian population. The so-called or self-styled Jews in Russia refused and resisted this plan vigorously. They refused to adopt the Russian alphabet in place of the Hebrew characters used in writing their Yiddish language. They resisted the substitution of the Russian language for Yiddish as their mother tongue. They opposed every attempt to bring about a complete assimilation of the former sovereign Khazar nation into the Russian nation. They resisted with every means of their disposal. The many forms of tension which resulted produced situations described by history as massacres, pogroms, persecution, and discrimination. In Russia at that period of history, it was custom, as in other Christian countries in Europe, at that time to take an oath, vow, or pledge of loyalty to the rulers and nobles, the feudal landholders, and others in the name of Jesus Christ. It was after the conquest of the Khazars by the Russians that the wording of the Kol Nidre, the all vows prayer, was altered. The new altered version of the Kol Nidre, all vows prayer, is referred to in the Talmud as the law of revocation in advance. The Kol Nidre prayer was regarded as a law of revocation in advance, and that's what I was referring to earlier. That the Kol Nidre is a vow in advance to disavow any vows that one takes. Okay, so I'll go ahead on to read to support that. The Kol Nidre prayer was regarded as a law. The effects of this law of revocation in advance. Okay, so it gives them the ability to revoke any vows that they may take in the coming 12 months in advance of having taken them. Okay, so the effect of this law of revocation in advance obtained for all who recited it each year on the eve of the Day of Atonement, divine dispensation from all obligations acquired under oaths, vows, and pledges to be made or taken in the coming year. The recital of the Kol Nidre, all vows prayer on the eve of the Day of Atonement released these so-called self-styled Jews from any obligation under oaths, vows, or pledges entered into during the next 12 months. Okay, and the point he makes is that this was altered to say that to basically allow any vows taken to be disavowed in advance. Okay, and so this basically nullified any vows that they took where they were required to take them in Russia. They did so, but they could disavow taking the oath. Okay, it says Christians soon believed that oaths, vows, or pledges were quite worthless when given by so-called or self-styled Jews. This was the basis for the so-called discrimination by governments, nobles, feudal landholders, and others who required oaths of allegiance and loyalties from those who entered their service. Now, the point of him addressing that is to basically lay the groundwork to establish the reason why these so-called Jews were being persecuted in Europe, and that ends up being the basis for what is referred to in history as the Jewish question. Okay. Let's see, how much time do we have and how much time are we taking? Do we know how much time we have, Brother Jamal? Okay, what if we want to go into any more here? Interesting. Just give me a minute. Okay, I'll go ahead and read this part. An intelligent attempt was made to correct the situation by a group of German rabbis in 1844. In the year they called an international conference of rabbis in Brunswick, Germany. They attempted to have the Kol Nidre, all vows prayer, completely eliminated from the Day of Atonement ceremonies and entirely abolished from any religious service of faith. They felt that this secular prologue to the Day of Atonement ceremonies was void of any spiritual implication and did not belong in any synagogue ritual. However, the preponderant majority of the rabbis attending that conference in Brunswick came from Eastern Europe. They represented congregations of Yiddish-speaking or self-styled Jews of converted Khazar origin in Eastern Europe. They insisted that the altar version of the Kol Nidre, all vows prayer, be retained exactly as it was cited on the Day of Atonement. They demanded that it be allowed to remain as it had been recited in Eastern Europe since the change by Meir ben Samuel 6 centuries earlier. It is today recited in exactly that form throughout the world by so-called self-styled Jews. Will the 150 million Christians in the United States react any differently when they become more aware of its insidious implications? Says at a cost of many millions of dollars, the National Conference of Christians and Jews succeeded in expunging from the New Testament passages which so-called or self-styled Jews regarded as offensive to their faith. A great portion of the cost is supplied by so-called or self-styled Jews. I think I need to go ahead and read this whole paragraph. And I think the reason that he's making this point in the book is to point out how it is that Christians will usually be supportive of the state of Israel. They see the return of Jews to the homeland as something that has been prophesized, and they see it as a fulfillment of prophecy. And so there's been created somewhat of a blind allegiance between Christians and Jews. Okay, so he says here, how genuine can the implications, inferences, and innuendos of the so-called brotherhood and interfaith movements be under these circumstances? These so-called movements are sweeping the nation like prairie fire. With the Talmud as the axis of political, economic, cultural, and social attitudes and activities of so-called or self-styled Jews participating in these so-called movements, how genuine are the oaths, vows, and pledges taken or given in connection with these two so-called movements by so-called or self-styled Jews? It would be a superlative gesture of brotherhood or of interfaith if the National Conference of Christians and Jews succeeded in expunging from the Talmud all anti-Christ, anti-Christian, and anti-Christianity passages. At a cost of many millions of dollars, the National Conference of Christians and Jews succeeded in expunging from the New Testament passages which so-called or self-styled Jews regarded as offensive to their faith. A great portion of the cost was supplied by so-called or self-styled Jews. Okay, again, remember when I said The Bible, King James Version, said, King James Version commissioned the 16, or the Holy Bible, commonly referred to as the King James Version, commissioned in 1611, commonly referred to as the King James Version, translated out of the original tongues, diligently compared and revised. Okay, and so the Bible has been subject to continuous revisions, and it says here that some of these, if not many of these revisions, were initiated by the so-called or self-styled Jews. Okay, so we will leave it there for now, and we will probably take this up again on the next show. We will go a little bit more into this information and maybe take it forward to how things are affecting us, and I'll go back to when I was pointing out the regions that were occupied by the former Khazars after they were dispersed include the Ukraine. That's the country that was slipped my mind. And so there's a war going on right now in the Ukraine, and I've always been really curious as to why, on top of the fact that there is a strategic alliance and reason for the United States support for the Ukraine, but there also appears to be some type of connection to what we're talking about now to the Ukraine, because the Ukraine is one of those areas that were populated by the conversos, if you will, from the Khazar religion to the religion of Judaism, which was formerly known as Talmudism. Okay, so we'll leave that there, and we'll pick this up again on the next show. I hope you found this to be informative, and again, the book, if you want to read this information for yourself, it's an excellent, very concise book called Facts Are Facts, compiled by, actually written by Benjamin H. Friedman. Okay, so with that, we'll close out. Thank you for joining Journey into Self. I hope you found this to be informative, and also, if you are on the spiritual path and would like some assistance, or need some counsel or guidance, I'm certainly here for you for that. And please visit my website, which is www.sa-ra.org, and I will offer a free 30-minute counseling session for you, and we can determine how I can be of service and if we're good fits for each other. So with that, thank you for joining yourself, and we'll see you next time. Protect.